All right. So that being said, we can use ATP in a variety of ways. And I already talked about one example, but I want to include that and formalize some other ones. It turns out most of life, most of the interesting things in life are delta G positive. Example of ATP used to drive essential delta G positive reactions. Okay. Number one, it turns out, there are many such examples, but that amino acids, to string them together into proteins, is delta G positive. That the bonds in the protein are actually weaker than the bonds in the free amino acids. But the cell must do it. Right? The cell's got to do it. You've got to make proteins. They won't form on their own. It turns out it costs, if you like, 3 ATP per amino acid added. That is 3 ATP going to 3 ADP and 3 phosphates. Right? So for every amino, if you think about how large proteins are in your body, the hundreds of amino acids, it costs lots of ATP. You're burning up lots of ATP all the time just to make the new proteins you need to deal with the ones you've recycled. So just sitting there, not moving at all, you're consuming a fair amount of energy to do that thing. Other examples, it turns out that other chemical reactions. So, for example, making some monomers. It takes ATP to do that. And also, as I said above, moving your muscles, right, requires ATP input. So, for example, lifting a box, it's a sort of weird chemical reaction. If you have the box down and it gets converted to box up, again, it's a very weird way to look at a chemical reaction, but it's two states of this thing, the box down low and the box up high. Right? That's a delta G positive reaction on its own. Delta G positive. We can couple that, though, to lots of ATP being converted to lots of ADP and phosphate. And that's delta G, very large negative. And what happens, this is done via an enzyme called myosin, which I alluded to earlier. You can add these two up, and the net reaction is delta G negative, so it happens. All right. And so I get the energy to do this in my muscles by burning up. If not, burning up is not quite the right word. Breaking. So down here in my muscles, there's lots of ATP. When I lift this up, a lot of that ATP has been converted to ADP and phosphate. And we'll talk a little bit about how you get it back in a second. But the energy for doing this is coming from breaking down probably millions of, or perhaps probably hundreds of millions of molecules of ATP, converting them to ADP and phosphate. Gives me the energy to do that. So this thing, which would not happen on its own, can now happen. And also all these sorts of other things. Walking, breathing, thinking, all of those things require energy input. They would not happen on their own, the delta G positive reactions. So there's thousands of reactions. In fact, most of the interesting ones in your body require energy input, and you get it from ATP. You could write this in a sort of shorthand way, often written as something like this. So you have the box down, and it's converted to the box up. And along the way, you turn some ATP into ADP and phosphate, and it's done by myosin. So myosin makes those two reactions happen together. All right. So there's lots of things your body uses ATP for. So another thing they told me in high school is they called the energy currency of the cell, in the same sense that money, dollar bills, are used to pass around value. In fact, so the dollar bills in my wallet are equivalent of my working here, teaching you guys. I can convert them into a hamburger if I like. That is somebody else's work. That's a currency for work. Same thing here. As we'll see in a minute, ATP, what I've showed you is how you can spend ATP. That cells have lots of reactions to spend the energy in ATP to do various things that they need to do. Questions about that before we talk about where it comes from? All right. So the thing is, and this is actually the other half of the picture because it's a very big deal. If you look per cell, you have about 1 billion molecules of ATP in your cell. But about 10 billion ATP are converted to ADP and phosphate per second. Is there a problem there? How long, if that was the whole story, how long would you expect to live? About 1/10 of a second, right? Because if you're going to be trying to use up 10 billion molecules per second and you've only got 1 billion in each cell, then you got about a tenth of a second to live before you run out of energy and you can't do all those things that you need to do. Your muscles quit moving, your heart stops beating, you stop breathing, you can't make proteins, your history, right? So clearly that can't be the whole story, right? There's got to be some place to get those ATPs back. Otherwise, you can't live, right? You got to have some source for those, right? And so it turns out, therefore, you need rapid recycling. All right. And so what I want to draw now is the ATP, let me write this more neatly, cycle. All right. And that's the following. I need a little bit more space for this. So in the middle we've got ADP and phosphate, and that gets converted to ATP, and it also can get recycled. So it goes around and around. And what I want to talk about is two different colors over here. On one side, I want to have these reactions. Okay. And these are reactions needed for life. Right? That is, they're delta G positive without ATP's help. Right? That is, things like move, make proteins, etc. Right? Actually, let me change this a tiny little bit. I'm sorry. I got to do this a little bit more carefully. There's a cycle here. All right? So there's some reactions needed for life. And then on the other side, there are some other reactions. Right? These are reactions that release lots of energy. That is, their delta G, big negative delta G. There are things, we're going to talk about them in a minute, glycolysis and respiration. And basically there you burn food to get energy. All right? So what I want to ask you to do and talk to your neighbor about is, where do the arrowheads go on those, the two black lines and the blue and the green line? So there are a couple of reactions, so things happening together. Like, remember I said, lifting up the box. Delta G plus on its own happens at the same time you're breaking down ATP, right? In all of these reactions, right, you got to have, so one of these set of reactions is consuming ATP, one of them is producing ATP. So think about that first, which one's going to be making ATP, and which ones are going to be consuming ATP. And then, so therefore, which arrows heads go where. So there's 4 arrowheads, a green one, a blue one, and 2 black. So talk to your neighbor, based on what I just said, where do the arrowheads go on those lines? and then we'll call names. All right, so get a consensus, and let's see what we got. And I'll give you your choice of arrows. So Hala, are you here? Oh, so tell me. Yep, so blue arrow, up or down? Blue is going down. All right, so that means... So, okay, cool. So let me draw that in and see how that looks. So the blue arrow is going down. So those are and because of the convention of the way we draw arrows, that makes where does the black, so what arrowhead on the 8, is there an arrowhead here or up at the top on this side? So what do you, Al, you want to give? On the bottom, exactly, because the arrows sort of shoop together. That's the convention with these things, that they happen together. So what this says is there are some chemical reactions, and we'll call them, just for the sake of giving them a name. So A is turning to B, being very creative like that. A is turning to B. When A turns into B, that reaction, A to B on its own, is monster negative delta G, way spontaneous, lots of energy released, enough energy released that you can actually use it to recharge ATP. Okay? That's exactly right, that these reactions charge up the ATP. And so on the other side, the green arrow, you want to go for it? Yeah. Green arrow's got to go up because for a variety of reasons, including just sort of our convention, right? As they sort of have to shoop together. But those reactions they break down ATP, they extract the energy. So I want to fill something in and then show you what I mean by this. Thank you. So basically, the energy flow is this way, and ATP is the energy carrier. Basically, what it does is ATP takes the energy from these reactions and shares it out. So there's a couple reactions over here that basically make all the money in the cell, and then ATP carries it out to all other reactions in the cell. Let me give you do a little interpretive dance as best I can. So so that's ADP, right? If I have this covalently bonded onto me, I am ATP. So Levi, for your question, the difference between this is ATP and that's ADP. Right? The phosphate's free. ADP doesn't hide phosphates behind its back, but you have to pretend they're not there. All right. So how does this business work? All right. So if I'm ADP, I'm relatively low energy. I feel that way. I'm coming down with a cold. But if I go over to here, and these are the reactions, these A to B, this over here, the overhead projector, is like some bunch of chemical reactions that have a very powerful negative delta G that release a lot of energy. So through some clever mechanisms, which we'll talk about in a little bit and also on Friday, they're able to cram a phosphate on. So they charge me up. Now I have a lot more energy, right? Doesn't mean I move around faster, but I have free energy available for chemical reactions. And so, for example, if you are some chemical reaction in the cell that needs some energy, I can give you that energy not by giving you the phosphate, but by breaking that bond. It releases energy so you can do your thing. And then I roam around the cell again. Low energy, I get charged up again, and I can go over here, and maybe over here there's a muscle that needs to move something. So as it moves, the phosphate goes off, and now all of a sudden I'm ATP and ADP, and I'm low energy again. And so what I'm doing bit by bit, I come over here, and I get charged up, and I go wandering about the cell looking for somebody who needs some energy, and say, if you guys need some, then this breaks, and the energy gets to your chemical reaction, etc. And so I carry energy from those to all around the cell. So you can make energy and make ATP in one place and distribute it all over the place, and then that energy can be consumed throughout the cell. And so it's evolutionary. It was just easier to use this energy currency, because now if there's some chemical reaction you want to involve, some new chemical reaction needs energy, all you have to do is be able to grab onto ATP, break that bond, poof, and you get a shot of energy to do whatever you need to do. Questions about that before we talk about some more details? Yeah? So what happens to the phosphate, the part I can't model with this interpretive dance is basically these get slurped up. They diffuse around the cell. What really happens is a loose phosphate happens to bump into me and this thing, and we get stuck together at once. All right, so they get recycled also. It's just hard to show that with pieces of paper. Right, right. Yeah. Yes. So to put it, so I like that terminology and I don't like it, so I'm going to say it. This part over here makes ATP, and this part over here uses ATP, and that's totally legit. The thing you have to be a little bit careful about is I'm not making the ATP from scratch over here. It's not like I'm taking atoms and cramming them together to make ATP. All I'm really doing is making ATP from ADP and phosphate, so I'm sticking a phosphate on. But if you're careful with your shorthand, so that what you mean by making ATP is this, then I'm cool with that. But and then breaking it down is over here. But if you want to be very precise, you'd say I'm putting a phosphate on ADP to make ATP. Right. Other questions? Yeah. Well, what happens to the lone hydrogen? There's a bunch of things in this reaction. Actually, water is involved in this, and H+ is involved. To try to balance this chemically turns out to be quite challenging because it happens in a cell with all kinds of strange things going on. So the chemist would have a cow, but we sort of ignore those things in biology because you're swimming in a soup of water. It has to balance, but it turns out to be really hard to do it. Other questions?